And for those dazzled by the streets of Beijing, its high rises and the visible affluence on display, here's the other side. Nearly 6% of people in rural China fall in the poverty bracket, with those numbers rising to 10% in some parts of Western China and 12% among ethnic minorities. According to World Bank data, 493 million people, or 36% of China's population, is poor. But China claims that only 30 million people live below the national poverty line. The World Bank says poor Chinese live on $5.50 a day or $165 a month. China says its poor earn $355 a month. The World Bank has also warned of rising inequality of incomes evident in the gap between urban and rural China. But China says it has lifted more than 60 million people out of poverty since 2012 and is close to eradicating absolute poverty by 2020, a goal set at the 19th Party Congress by President Xi Jinping. He called it achieving a society where people lead comfortable lives with all their material needs met. Now, how accurate is it to rely on Chinese statistics? According to the American Interest, an online journal, China's economic figures have long been viewed dubiously by Western economists. The journal refers to the admission by China's top statistician in January last year that officials of Liaoning province had inflated the province's GDP figures over a 3-year period beginning 2011. An analysis by the Financial Times showed many other provinces dependent on coal, steel and oil industries reporting GDP figures that were out of sync with what the rest of the world was experiencing in those very industries. Now, the Borgen Project, a non-profit based in Seattle in the United States working on poverty and hunger issues, has identified a number of parameters that lend credence to the view that China may be fudging its figures. In 2016, it reported that 1 in every 10 Chinese is poor. 82 million people live below the poverty line. 200,000 Chinese have no access to electricity. More than 6 million Chinese have no access to clean fuel for cooking or heating. It also notes the progress made. More than 12 million people rose out of poverty in 2013, and nearly half of poor Chinese are no longer in that bracket. But China does have a poverty problem, and the boy walking to school in freezing temperatures is testimony to that. Joining me this evening from Boston this time around is the author Einar Tangen. Einar, good evening. Thanks for joining us here on the broadcast. Do you feel enough is being done to help children, especially poor children in rural families in China?
Well, there's two parts to this. One is this kind of heartwarming tale about this young man who's intent on getting his education. You'll note in the video, when you see it, next to his swollen hands, is very, very neat writing that he was doing for his exam itself. The second problem is really related to this kind of migrant worker issue. His parents, his mother actually left the family when he was quite young. His father works in another city and only sees them maybe twice a year. So it's a very, very difficult. China has been wrestling with this problem. Obviously, when you go at breakneck speeds in terms of your economic development, social issues tend to lag. But I do think Xi Jinping has struck the right note. I mean, at the 19th Party Congress, he put poverty, pollution, and systemic risk on there. I know you talked about the GDP figures. Yes, those, even by the Chinese government standards, they take it with a grain of salt when they get numbers in from these local municipalities. But when you start talking about poverty and things like that, I think they have a pretty good handle on that. And I don't think anyone is disputing it. In terms of the world IMF saying the poverty numbers, the UN saying the poverty numbers differ. It's the difference between whether it's going to be over $5 a day or $1.90 a day in terms of income.
Can I ask you, though, you brought up poverty and pollution as two of the focus points that President Xi Jinping talked of in 2017. Do you think there's a dichotomy there, because tackling pollution is going to have to mean tackling conventional forms of, industry where fuel is consumed in the form of coal, and that is something that President Xi has talked about cutting down on. But aren't those the conventional employment-generating industries as well?
Well, yes and no. I mean, traditionally, these kind of highly polluting industries, a lot of them came in from the outside. Actually, it was foreign corporations who set up here, who were attracted by the lax environmental standards. It's similar to what you're experiencing in India now. People who come in, and even some of the locals, do not obey the environmental standards, resulting in massive pollution. In terms of the government and what they're doing about it, yes, they're moving it along. It is going to take some sacrifice. Xi Jinping indicated that he was willing to take a little less growth in return for having a less polluted society. It's a question of necessity. I'm sure everyone in India understands this, especially if they live in an urban area. But he also said, look, he's going to do something about poverty. He has a plan. They have 30 million in poverty. They have individuals looking not only at the family, the individuals, but families and villages to determine whether they're sufficient, whether they can be there as it is. If you're disabled, obviously you may not be able to work, so there might be a subsidy involved. If you're in an area where it does not support farming and you're a farmer, then they have to move you. This is something that China has been able to do because they have this kind of centralized economy. Right. A lot of people don't like it, but it does help in terms of the overall picture down the line.
This little boy that we started off the story from, he's referred to as a left-behind child, and that's a pretty common phenomenon in China, where parents leave small towns, go to big cities to earn, to really speaking, raise those same children that they've left behind. Do you think that children like these are more prone to tough childhoods? And also, do you think generating employment outside of big cities in perhaps smaller provincial areas is really going to be key in China's fight against poverty?
Well, obviously, the left-behind child issue is a major one in China. You've seen the massive outpouring of sympathy and concern by an increasingly middle-class society. They feel very strongly that this has to happen. But what you mentioned second, in terms of more economic development outside these major cities, is already becoming a priority for the Chinese government. They've seen that megacities do not work. They've already limited the number of people who can live in Shanghai, Beijing, expect it to spread to the other major cities. And then they're going to have a much more comprehensive economic development program. This, of course, runs counter to kind of free market ideas that people should just move wherever. But, when you're building schools, roads, hospitals, all the infrastructure necessary to take care of people, you have to be very, very careful that you're, not overbuilding in one place and underbuilding in another. Planning is very important, as you know in India.
Absolutely. One last question, Einar. Some of the comments I've been reading online about this young boy's story. It talks about China's, fight against poverty, the war against poverty, really speaking. Can you tell us about where exactly that plan is at this point in time and what it entails? And what do you think of criticism that says that the plan has failed because it's not addressing issues for people living in rural areas in China and even ethnic minorities in China?
Well, there are always quibbles over what is actual poverty. I mean, in India, you have obviously a lot more of it. The issue in China is what they're doing about it, and what you said earlier, what is the plan? Xi Jinping has requested that he has I think almost 22 million people working throughout China individually on these 30 million people who are in poverty, putting together individual dossiers on what the recommendation should be for the individual, the family, the village, or the city in terms of, either moving people away or moving businesses into that particular area. A lot of the problems with these migrant workers is that they live in areas which are not sustainable. The agriculture just does not either make enough money, or the area itself is just not productive. So they're forced to leave their villages. Unfortunately, the reality is that you cannot change that equation And it does not make sense to build roads and put in electricity and sewer and water to an area which is not sustainable. And this is the tough decision that China is making. It's something that maybe India will be taking a closer look at, but it's very heartwarming that those in India are taking a personal interest in the affairs of a small boy who's trying to make his way in the world.